Hello, my name is Don Elliott, and I am a director with Clarion Associates, which is the consulting firm that Rochester has retained to help rewrite its land development manual. More specifically, to redo the land development manual as a unified development code that will bring together all of the different restrictions or opportunities that apply to particular parcels of land, to try to get it into one place. This is a 2-year effort that is just beginning now. The first step in that effort is to do an outline to review the current LDM, let you know what we have heard from stakeholders about what needs to be fixed and what we see as a national zoning consulting firm about things that could be done more efficiently or more clearly, and organize that information into a detailed outline of how the new Unified Development Code would look and work, and also a crosswalk showing you how all of the existing content would find its way into the new structure so that you could search through this document. We've just delivered to this document. It's called Outline and Crosswalk, and you can search through this document to find where a provision that you're particularly concerned about lives in the new structure for the Unified Development Code. So the purpose of the project are aligned with basically Plan to Succeed, your comprehensive plan for Rochester. They include things like implementing that plan, working on affordable housing and housing diversity, improving connectivity and provisions in the zoning ordinances dealing with health and safety, and finally redoing it to make it as user-friendly as possible. If we've heard one thing throughout this process, it is that the current ordinance is very long and very complex and very hard for people to use, especially citizens, simply because of the way it is structured and because things have been added onto over time so many different ways. We have stated in public meetings before, from our perspective, it looks like it's been added onto and added onto and added onto, and that several of the provisions in here are workarounds because the actual written text is so complex and interrelated and detailed. More and more applicants and developers have just said, well, I want to go around that. I want to negotiate my own restricted development or my own incentive development. There are tools in here to not have to do what the code seems to imply you would do in that zone district, and we think we have recommended that those workarounds not be necessary. You shouldn't be working around the details in your own ordinance. Fix the ordinance so that it says what you want it to say and it's more predictable for citizens, builders, both. So let's talk about this. This 2-year process is near the beginning. This slide shows the timeline. The very first thing is the outline and crosswalk, which was intended to be finished by March of 2020. We're on schedule. That's what we're here to present today. And this would have been an in-person presentation, but for the travel restrictions. So I'm going to walk through this presentation just as if I was there. And then it'll be available. Staff is going to distribute a questionnaire along with this video so that if you want to ask questions, staff can answer them or ask us to help answer them. So one of the key things when we looked at the Land Development Manual was to align it with the goals and the types of places that your comprehensive plan to Succeed, calls for. It's a very progressive plan. It's an ambitious plan. It was adopted 2 years ago, but it says we want different kinds of places, especially away from the stable neighborhoods. As we do the various mixed use and not low density parts of the city, we need different types of places, more transit orientation, and the question is, how do you structure zone districts to achieve that? The next 4 slides show you how we have recommended that your current menu of zoning districts be changed. So the first slide covers agricultural and residential districts. In each of these slides, on the left hand is your current menu of districts in this category. On the right hand is our recommended changes to that. I have highlighted the ones I really want to call your attention to, although you are free to ask questions of staff or post them, and staff can ask us to respond to questions about any part of this proposed restructuring. So one of the changes is that the CNR, Core Neighborhoods Residential District, would be eliminated. Frankly, there's no land zoned into this. It has not been used, or it has been already rezoned into another district. I would also call your attention to the R2S. That is a new zone district. Your current minimum lot size in the R2 district is 5,500 square feet. R2X, which was adopted last year, brings it down to 3,000 square feet. But communities all around the country are saying if we really want to promote smaller, more affordable lots so that our working people, teachers and police and fire folks, can potentially afford to buy a house in our community, we need to come up with smaller lot sizes. And so the proposal is for a new R2S, low density, small lot zone district to be created, which would have a 2,000 square foot minimum lot size. The proposal right now is not to remap existing neighborhoods, but to put it on the books so that as it's appropriate to implement the plan, that could be mapped in the future. So to summarize, there were not very many changes in the residential districts. People in Rochester like the neighborhoods they live in, and they have not been calling for change. The changes are to open up new opportunities that would be mapped when council feels that's appropriate. The next slide addresses the proposed changes in mixed-use districts, and in here, this area, there's a lot of change recommended. Mixed-use districts means a zone district in which you can do either a primary use of residential development or non-residential development, or a mix of both. It doesn't have to be a mix of both. It opens up the opportunity to have both. Right now, a lot of that is being approved through your restricted development process, capital R, capital D. Since the first day we showed up in Rochester, we have been told that process needs some very serious work. It is used extensively because it's a way around the issues in our ordinance. So we are going to be revisiting restricted development. But the first step in that process is to say, you don't need to use restricted development for mixed use. Mixed use development in almost all newer ordinances are simply a set of zone districts, small, medium, large, special purpose, within which you can do residential or non-residential development. So on the left hand of this slide, you'll see your current commercial and business zones, and on the right hand side is our proposed menu of districts that would address this in a better way. This will take a little bit more time to walk through. Your current B2 and B5 districts are recommended to be merged or combined into a mixed-use neighborhood scale district. This is convenience shopping on a small scale that would be walkable from neighborhoods, not in the middle of the neighborhood, but walkable from them, and not so big as it would attract destination traffic. Very popular idea, supported by Plan to Succeed. Neither B2 nor B5 really does that now. You have to go through some other types of approvals. Similarly, B1 is restricted commercial right now. We're recommending that would be brought over to mixed-use, street-oriented, and a new district called mixed-use center would be, sometimes you get mixed use along a corridor, and that's the way it's been developed. You can, whether you like it or not, it is along a corridor, and that's one type of zone district. In other areas, you have medium-scale development, which is oriented around a place, a center, a plaza, something that is not along a street, but along a corner between two streets that is a place, and that requires a different type of mixed-use district, which we are calling mixed-use center. You have a B4, which is your general commercial. It already allows some residential development, and that would be retitled as mixed-use general. Your mixed redevelopment is really something that is dealing with an institution, and most newer ordinances have a mixed-use institutional zone district. College campuses, medical campuses that are not state-owned, subject to local zoning. This is something that allows a lot of flexibility for big institutions to do what they have to do to be successful in the middle of their property, while being a good neighbor to the neighborhoods around them on the edges of their property. But it's a different type of mixed-use district. And as you can understand, they might need to do housing or to do dormitories, things like that in that institutional setting. Mixed-use transit-oriented is a renaming of the TOD district that was adopted last year in implementation of the P2S plan. It's a carryover. And finally, your CDC downtown is being relabeled as mixed-use downtown. There are 4 sub-districts right now. We think 3 of them are just carryovers, and the 4th is really a residential. It is CDC residential, and that should probably be done as a residential district. Let's move to the next slide. So special purpose districts are, as they say, things that serve a particular purpose. It's not mainly residential, and it's not a place where you want a mix of residential and commercial. They're mostly non-residential. Things like business parks, light industry with a special character that has perhaps more tricky procedures or materials that they use, In Rochester, that's likely to be research, not building cars. But it is a heavier version of an industrial district. Right now you have two districts holding an interim, which are basically ways of holding land that has been brought into the city where the developer or the city have agreed they're not ready to zone it for a particular zone yet. That's fine, but they don't need to be two different ones, and so we're recommending that they get merged. Developing district in the current ordinance is simply an umbrella group over some places that was intended, I think, to say we're not quite sure what we're going to do here. We need more flexibility in these types of districts. That's fine, but that flexibility should be built into the zoning ordinance. It doesn't need this developing district penumbra over the top of it, and so we're recommending that that be removed. It doesn't actually serve a purpose right now. And then PUDs, Rochester has not done PUDs for many years, but it still appears in the LDM. People in Rochester know it's not available, but let's take it out of the LDM. The procedures for amending the ones that have already been approved in the past, they need to stay in the Unified Development Code, but the district itself does not need to stay in the code. Finally, there are overlay districts, which is a second layer of zoning that supersedes what's down below it. The classic example is a floodplain. No matter what you're zoned underneath, if you're in the flood risk area, you have additional restrictions. That's the example of an overlay district. We have several recommendations in this area, mostly to bring together the different types of restrictions or limitations that may be applicable to land, even if they're not actually administered by the City of Rochester. So, for example, airport protection overlay is administered semi-independently from the City of Rochester, but if you have land in that area, you need to know what the FAA flight heights are, what the safety zones are. We recommend that come in, as it is in most newer ordinances, so that a property buyer or some user understands what the restrictions are imposed by the federal government. Decorah Edge is a county-administered district, but it affects what you can do with your property. It's a carryover. You have two overlay nows which deal with parking, downtown and the DMC, Destination Medical Center parking overlays. Overlays are an awkward way to deal with parking. In both cases, these are having special parking requirements, lowering or eliminating them. Fine, that's fine, but it doesn't need to be an overlay district. You just define those areas within the parking restrictions, or the parking chapter, and that is the way most modern codes are written. It's very rare to find a parking overlay these days, and because there's a more easy and basic way to get at the changes that you want to impose in these areas. Flood-related districts are being carried over once again. In the case where these restrictions are not administered or enforced by Rochester, the UDC will say that. But the fact that they're administered by somebody else does not mean you shouldn't put the property owners and the citizens of Rochester on notice as to what the restrictions on their property are. Our recommendation is that comes in with a caveat where it's administered jointly or by somebody else. Special districts are kind of one-offs. It's another one of these workarounds where people tailor things in minor ways. We recommend that to the greatest degree possible be eliminated. If you have a particular SD applicable to your property, obviously you have an approval. That approval will be honored and carried forward, but not as a special district overlay zone district. We can do it through site plan approvals, other types of things. But we do recommend that there be a local character overlay, which is different in type. Local character overlays are things that most newer ordinances include, so that when a particular neighborhood of the city or a particular unique development corridor wants special restrictions that are not intended to get around the basics of the LDM, but are intended to preserve a unique character in that neighborhood or that corridor, this is where you put it. So we are recommending that be a new thing, not the same as special districts, but similar. But the way to think about it is broader and neighborhood-based rather than narrower and tailored for, frankly, exceptions to what the LDM currently requires. Finally, shoreline district is a Minnesota requirement that's being carried over. That's the end of the discussion on aligning the menu of zone districts with Plan 2S. Please do contact staff with any thoughts on this or answer the questionnaire to raise questions or concerns about this. Let's move on. In addition to recasting the menu of zone districts, we want to display them in a much more user-friendly way. So this slide shows a sample layout from another community. I want to emphasize that where graphics and tables are shown in this presentation, from now on, they're from other communities where we have done similar things, and they are examples of how we communicate the information. None of this has been drafted for Rochester yet. So, in this layout, there is a purpose statement, there is a drawing of the intended scale and character of the area, a picture which is not regulatory. It is communicative of the character, intended feel of the place. And on the right-hand side, basic height, setback, density limitations or opportunities in that district. How tall can it be? How big can it be? Is it close to the street? Is it far from the street? And a diagram illustrating how those are measured. This is a 2-page spread that attempts to communicate for each of the new zone districts or recast zone districts the basics that citizens can understand. If they need to get into more detail, of course they can, and the spread will tell them that. But this is the picture about what the intention of the type of neighborhood is and the basic standards. Next slide shows a permitted use table. And that is basically consolidating in one place the different uses that are available in different zone districts in Rochester. It's extremely useful. In my 25-year career, only 2 communities have not done a table like this. Both of them came back later and said we should have done a table like this. The left-hand column lists in an ordered way all of the different types of uses that are available in Rochester. This is only the first few lines of that slide, but you can see residential uses, and under that household living. So if new uses are proposed in the future, you can figure out where they ought to live in this logical structure. Then you can see by the gray shading of the columns, is it a residential district? Is it allowed in a residential district? Or is this a mixed-use district? Or is it a special purpose district? Your district will be different than this table, but that typology, is it mostly about living? Is it about living and or working together? Is it about not living, but working or doing something special? That is a typology that is usually used these days. In each cell it says P for permitted, that's all of them are P for permitted here, but there are also other abbreviations at the top, conditional use, accessory use, temporary use, which you would find if we showed you the whole table. In the right-hand column are any special standards that apply to that use. For example, and I'm just making this up, bed and breakfasts are allowed in this district, but you can't operate after 10 p.m. Bed and breakfasts are allowed in this district, but you can't have weddings concerning having more than 50 people because it's a low-density district. So all of the additional conditions or opportunities that appeal to that zone district are cross-referenced in the right-hand column, and in the code you click on them and you go to the text of that restriction, which appears right after the table. This is an extremely useful tool which will require some significant reordering of the current LDM. The next slide talks about that's a chapter on development standards and incentives, not the use of the land, but how do you lay it out? What are the quality standards in Rochester? And it covers a lot of territory. So here's the table of contents. Introduction and a summary table, I'll show you in a minute. It covers things like dimensional. It tells you in more detail, in each zone district, how tall can it be, what are the exceptions to that, how far from the street can it be, what are the exceptions to that, how much lot coverage can there be, is there a floor area ratio, much more detailed than the 2-page spread, but laid out in detail here. Also things like stormwater, drainage, access, connectivity, landscaping, parking, site design, sustainability and resilience, affordable housing incentives that are available. This is where we put all of the material that is not, can I do it, and or whose approval do I need? This is the chapter that brings together how do I do it in Rochester? How do I need to do it? And how much flexibility is there in that? At the beginning of the development standards chapter, there'll be a table like this one, which again is from another community, simply listing on the left-hand column all of those sections that I just listed off, and then where you find the details, and then where this is applied. Is it at the subdivision stage? Is it at the site planning stage? When is this relevant and when is it not relevant because the proposal is too conceptual to actually apply these standards? The final part of the outline is procedures and administration. How does Rochester do business? Whose approval do you need and how will they make the decision? The table of contents is on this slide here. One important change is that all the common procedures, things that apply to many types of application, would be in one section. We find that a very helpful way to not have to repeat things over and over again. There's similarly all the flexibility and relief section provisions. How much of an adjustment can staff or the planning commission or city council make to this is in one section. As mentioned earlier, two of the things that we were originally charged to do for Rochester is to redo the restricted development section and the incentive section, so those will appear in here as well. This slide shows a table where we summarize on the left-hand side all the different kinds of applications you can apply for in the city of Rochester. Across the top are where do we find the details of that procedure. Next is what kind of notice to the public is required. Next, do I need a pre-application conference before I file the application? And finally, who will review this? Who will decide it? And if I want to appeal the decision, who will hear the appeal? So it's a handy table to summarize the information in a way that we think very user-friendly. Similarly, for every type of application that can be filed, the Unified Development Code will have a flow chart like the one shown on this page. So one for each type of application in the city. Let's move on. Finally, one of the things that will make this project challenging is the fact that right now Rochester organizes a lot of its zoning information into tables like this one. This is a combination of what you can do with your property and how you need to lay it out, what we would call use regulations or development standards. So you can see the blue columns are really development standards. The blue columns are allowed uses that have to do with use regulations, but a lot of this material in the green columns is development standards. Rochester has put together two tables for each zone district. They're very detailed. We're going to have to pull them apart and reorganize them, as we have said in this presentation. That will be a big change. However, we'll start by saying, even though this is a very organized way to present the information, what has happened over time is that it is so rigid that people are getting around it through restricted development and incentive development. That's not a good practice. The good practice is to communicate this information and build in the flexibility so you don't have to go around these regulations. At the end of this document that's been posted, the outline and crosswalk, are two important tables. One of them shows you the outline that I have just walked through, the overall outline of the proposed Unified Development Code, and on the right-hand side, what it will include. Where is the current content going to be brought into there? And there's a lot of reorganization here, so it's a long table, but we're trying to answer how do we know that we're covering the current materials? The second table says, well, if I know the provision I'm used to looking at in the current LDM, where would that be covered in the new one? So one of them goes from the new ones will contain this older information, and the other one says, if you're wondering about the older information, here's how it lives in the new one. So this slide shows just the first few lines of the first table. So for example, we start off with general provisions, the subsections are listed there, title, purpose, applicability, and then the right-hand starts listing, okay, this is what's going to be brought into that section and reconciled and put in user-friendly language. The next slide shows the crosswalk, which says, okay, I know what I was paying attention to in the current LDM, and it starts with title, authority, administrative bodies. Where will that appear in the new ones? And again, there's a lot of different things that deal with the one topic, which will be brought together in the right-hand column. So that's an outline of what is in the document before you. It's a roadmap. We know from experience that things will change in the drafting process, but it's important to have this document reviewed publicly and to get that roadmap out so that when Clarion begins the next process, which is actually redrafting and drafting the UDC and making sure we've covered the topics that are now in the LDM, the Land Development Manual, we're not wasting money by drafting things that no one has approved as a way of organizing that material. So what's next? Well, this outline and crosswalk is a roadmap that we will use to decide which new sections we have to draft and what it needs to pull over or include or update from the current LDM. So it's important, but we know from experience that there will be changes along the way. We may find in the drafting process that things don't come out exactly this way, or staff may change its mind. That's fine, but this is the roadmap we're going to use, and the first part of that is to draft the districts and uses available along to this outline. So the next part will include the 2-page spreads on all of the proposed zoning districts, and then that table of what's allowed in each zone district and under what conditions, organized in a logical fashion. That's due to be done in the next several months. We hope to be able to come back and present that in person. But one way or another, we will keep on schedule and try to keep this process moving forward for the future of Rochester. Thank you.